and welcome to this episode of the Futurum Tech Webcast. Today, I'm joined by Chad Andrews from IBM, where he's the global leader for telecom, media, and entertainment at the IBM Institute for Business Value. And today, we're going to talk about 5G and edge computing and how those things will help redefine who wins in the booming digital economy. Chad, welcome. It's terrific to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I know you and I have talked before, and we've talked about this topic before. And so, to our listening and viewing audience, nerd alert, because we're both really into this topic. And I think that you're really going to love the conversation as well. So before we get started, Chad, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, about your background?
Well, one is any conversation with me needs the nerd alert. So I'm glad that you gave it right up front. My name's Chad Andrews. I'm located in Austin, Texas. And so there's like an AD-BC thing with my career. So before IBM, I co-founded a post-production services company, ran that in Los Angeles. It was bi-coastal. We also had some international offices. And then we sold that. I relocated to Austin, and I've been with IBM for about 9 years. And within the IBM career, I was started in services, and my main client was an independent software vendor that produced advertising software. So after doing that for a few years, I was given some global responsibilities for solutions in the media and entertainment practice at IBM. I was the global solutions leader for cloud video, and then advertising, and then spent a couple years building what was one of the largest blockchain projects for advertising.
Oh, wow. Very cool. So kind of a diverse background there. And now, I love what you're doing at the IBM Institute for Business Value. So talk with us a little bit about what that is and what you're doing there.
Sure. I've been in this role for about a year. And so IBM is organized by industries, by 13 major industries. So I have colleagues within the Institute for Business Value. And what we are is an independent think tank that provides advice for how to get business value out of technology to C-level executives at our clients.
Important.
Yeah,
right?
Well, we like
kind of important.
Yeah, and what distinguishes us is we do our own primary research, and we have a very deep analytics capability, as I think one would imagine with IBM. So we collect data primarily through surveys, and then we do a lot of very deep analysis on it to see what jumps out and what insights we can derive from our own research.
Awesome. So you and your team at the Institute published a report this month called The End of Communications Services as We Know Them. I always love titles that, are designed to get attention, right? That's the marketing strategist in me. And this is really all about 5G and edge computing, and how what we will see a dramatic shift in is the telco industry and how they operate. So tell us a little bit about, this bold statement about, the end of communication services as we know them. I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, the default is conservative at IBM. But we really thought this topic warranted the bold, provocative line that we took. It's not something we normally would do. We weren't just looking for attention. We really believe that we're at an inflection point within the evolution of the telco industry. And to an extent, because of the data that we collected, I should precurse this by, we did a survey of 500 global executives on the topics of 5G and edge computing. And the data we got back really led us to the conclusions that there has to be a wake-up call for the telcos in how they're pivoting in order to compete in the next chapter of the business.
Absolutely. Well, we've done a ton of research and writing on that very topic. And, there's so much opportunity for communication services providers, otherwise known as CSPs, out there. So much opportunity ahead, but it really is all about understanding what's disrupting the industry, what will disrupt the industry, and what to do strategically to be able to leverage that and take advantage of it.
Oh, absolutely. And so it's really interesting. I mean, again, nerd alert. I get really jazzed about this where we are in history of digital generally right now. So I happen to believe that some extraordinarily profound things are going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. And in fact, I believe that the period between about 2024 to 2028 will be the largest period of economic wealth creation and transference in the history of mankind, and it's not even going to be close. So, of course, that's all happening. So, one of the findings we had in our paper, we followed some breadcrumbs from third-party research that suggests that the overall global digital economy is somewhere around 20% of the overall world economy today. But by 2025, to go back, end of 2018, there was $7 trillion of GDP that was tied to digital platforms. By 2025, that's going to be 60 trillion, which is a third of all commerce. And when you look at the projections for, any analyst out there, the projections for growth of 5G and edge computing, the GDP incremental, most of it's happening from 2025 to 2030. So, if you sort of net that out, it's very likely that by the end of this decade, which is the 9 years left, the digital economy is going to be larger than the terrestrial economy, over 51%. So that's a 2 to 3x growth overall in the digital economy. So if you think of everything that's happened up today through the PC wave, through cloud computing, it was only the appetizer to the main course that we're about to have, which is, by the way, an economic expansion that is natively built on telecom networks.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk about, that's kind of overwhelming for a lot of people. I think when you hear predictions like that based on the data that you're seeing, I think for the average person, it's just like, holy moly, I know I need to embrace digital transformation as it relates to my business. I know my customers have different needs. I think sometimes people get bogged down in the, everyday business. I've got to take care of this, and this, and I'll think about that another time or whatever. Maybe it's like planning for retirement. I don't know. I'll think about this another time. Unfortunately, many people do that. But I do think that it is, you're 100% right. We are at the very beginning of what are substantial changes ahead. So specific to communication services providers, let's talk a little bit about, what their current lie is and some of the challenges that they have.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of double entendre with the word lie.
Right.
Some of them are lying to themselves, I think. I think so. Let's stay with this assumption that we could be off a bit on the actual size of the growth, but that we're about to go through a profound digital economic expansion. Well, a lot of that you have to understand. In cloud computing, we ended up with a centralized compute model. So resources are in large data centers, predominantly controlled by hyperscalers. And now we're seeing a change with 5G in order to take advantage of those capabilities of reduced latency, higher speed, machine-to-machine communications, and so on, that the compute is going to get pushed out to the edge of the network. And in order to so right now, most of the networks that have been deployed are non-standalone networks, which are a 4G core with 5G radio. We saw data from our survey that the standalone networks are going to really hit mainstream in about 2 to 3 years, which are cloud native networks. And in order to really get those capabilities out to the end users of the use cases, you need there needs to be a change in the radio infrastructure. So there has to be there have to be shorter wavelengths in order to actually be able to reach those end users. And so what we're going to see is this really dramatic densification of traffic and infrastructure from centralized to disaggregated. And we're also going to see a fusion of intelligence or compute capability, cloud network functions that are inherently interwoven with network functions. So the intelligence that feeds these next generation use cases for the enterprise and the consumer are going to be pushed out to highly diverse networks out of the
Okay, so what challenges do communication services providers have? Do they understand these changes ahead? Are they preparing for them? What are we seeing in the market?
Well, I don't know that they fully do. So I think one of the, all right, so all this technology is going to get pushed out to the edge, which is massive investments that are being shouldered by the CSPs. And yet, when you look at where the revenue growth is, it's at the application services solutions level. So that's where the money's being made. And we did another paper last year. I did a quick analysis and looked at the CapEx in 2019 spent by the world's top 10 web companies relative to the CapEx spent by the world's top CSPs by revenue. And what we found was that the CSPs were spending 2x on CapEx, and this was before a lot of investment for 5G and Edge, and yet the market cap of the web companies was 6x. So what you're seeing is that the CSPs are putting all this investment in, and yet the money is flowing into the cloud native companies that are providing the things that people are using digitally largely on mobile. So the CSPs have to really sort of understand that, and this next wave of use cases, let's take autonomous vehicles, just, I don't know when it's going to happen, if it's going to be, later in the decade, but that use case alone is projected to have 40 times the data traffic of the current overall networks, just in that use case alone. So magnify that in times orders of magnitude. I think a lot of the use cases that are coming, we can't really envision yet, because you have to get through a few of these doors to know what kingdoms lie beyond the next door. But we're going to have massive growth in the need for data traffic, need for technology capability located at the edge. The economics of that are such that you're taking, so the analogy I gave in the paper was that if today's networks are like your palms full of golf balls, the networks that are coming, the disaggregated networks, are like hands overflowing with sand in terms of their density.
Right.
So that's what's coming. But think economically, in order to support the level of investment CSPs need to shoulder, the economics of the entire industry have to change profoundly in 3 or 4 years, like they did in the cloud computing era, where you had step function increases in capability or performance and step function decreases in cost. So that has to happen as we're transitioning out of cloud computing era. The torch is being handed to network cloud, which is a whole new era that has to support the economics of the expansion. So that being said, if you think about it, only the providers that are capable of providing those step function enhancements are actually going to be able to scale from their networks. But what do those networks look like? Standalone networks are inherently cloud native. They're built and deployed and managed and orchestrated on cloud. So the findings in our paper was that when the hyper expansion comes around mid-decade, probably only providers that have digital platforms that are flexing network effects are actually going to be the source of almost all of that growth.
So if you snooze, you might well lose.
Yeah, I think it's actually sort of worse than that to an extent. And let me unpack that. So again, you have to be preparing now. There's a once in a generation shift in technology architectures and operating models and cultures that has to happen now. But are they doing that? Are the CSPs actually, are they treating it with the urgency that it warrants? And I would argue, again, data that we got from our survey, no. We found that CSPs generally, a small minority of them have identified use cases for the consumer and even less of them for the enterprise. So what they're doing, and then we also asked the question that identified where the CSPs would be in a set of stages from conceiving of use cases to optimizing them. Right. And what we found is very, very few, like single digits of the CSPs were planning to be in market with mature solutions, even in 5 years. So what they're doing is...
But I have to say here, In today's world, Chad, I don't care what business you're in. 5 years is an eternity.
Well, yes, and
It is.
completely 100% agree. The problems get compounded though. So what's happening? What's happening with the CSPs is they're taking a business case approach. They're waiting for the demand to be present before they make meaningful investments. Well, that's not what the hyperscalers are doing.
Right.
And the hyperscalers look at edge as being an opportunity to take their currently consolidated centralized cloud model and push it out to the edge on carrier networks to increase their share. And importantly, to extend their advantages with network effects. And the network effects are extraordinarily important. And in the paper, we really define three, we call it the platform economic advantage. And really, the way we describe that is three interlocking network effects that have a combinatorial effect on providing advantages to the companies that operate them. And so a good example of what we're talking about, like think of like a YouTube or a Facebook. Plenty of ways to make money as a partner or a developer within those ecosystems, but none that are outside of the control of Google and Facebook, right? So, but the three advantages are: one is the data network effect, which is pretty obvious. We provide data about ourselves. That gets mined into intelligence, which provides us some type of advantage. In YouTube and Facebook, it's obvious in terms of curation of our experience. That provides loyalty. We share more data, it gets that flywheel going, and pretty soon the scale of the data being collected in those walled gardens is enormous. And then we have the cloud network effect, which is through the sheer scale you have of the deployments globally, the costs end up falling precipitously. I worked for another vendor prior to IBM that produced hardware. These companies are often spearheading these open source initiatives to really drive down those costs. And often they're making the decisions on behalf of the collective of the ecosystems on standards initiatives. But the cost structures and the balance sheets of these companies end up getting weaponized to a degree where it's very, very hard to compete with them. You saw how many CSPs tried to create data center businesses too late and exited because
Right.
It's knives to gunfights. You just can't do it. And then the third network effect is what we call platform control points. So what this essentially means, it's the rules, tools, and conventions by which developers and ecosystem partners convene around an environment. And so again, think of YouTube and Facebook as the interfaces with those environments are the tools that are provided to the community. And when you combine those network effects, what you're seeing is what you see in the dominance of the hyperscalers. It becomes essentially impossible to compete with. And so that's just to kind of net out the impact of this. Because the economics have to change by orders of magnitudes relatively quickly in a generational shift in the next 3 to 5 years, if you don't have network effects, the platform economic advantage, you will not be the source of the hypergrowth. That's because in order for that hypergrowth to be consumed by you as an operator, you need to be able to provide, both capability and economics, well beyond your competitors. And so when you look at CSPs and you ask, honestly, are they on pace to evolve and transform to be able to provide that level of capability and economic advantage? And, I would say it's, for most of them, no.
Right. By and large, our research on this shows that the answer is no. So I want to touch on the economics of this. We're not, I think the point of this conversation certainly is not to beat up on CSPs. I think if anything, this is a really important time. And this is, if you're not thinking strategically, maybe conversations like this will help you do that, right? And research like you and your team are doing, and research like we're doing will help you do that. But when it comes to the digital transformation of telcos, there are huge advantages to early adoption, and smart CSPs are going to take advantage of that. I looked at your research, and one of the things that stood out to me is that high performers are expected to outperform financially from 5G enabled edge computing, no doubt, right? But here's the numbers. Like 45%, like high performers, so people who are seeing this coming, who are making the right moves, who are making the right investments, who are, putting things in motion now, are 45% are expected to financially outperform in 2 years. That's a lot.
Yeah, and there are a couple things I want to unpack here. First of all, the report is end of communication services as we know them.
Right.
So this is not a death knell to
No. It's a sort of a rebirth, right?
It's a rebirth. Yeah, certainly. It's a call to arms is really what I would say. There's a lot of advantages that CSPs can have. And one of the things we found as well. So when you mentioned high performers, let me explain that. So we surveyed 500 global executives, half from the business side, half from the technology side of the house. And we found 14%. So we had a question that asked the operators to define how their organization performed over the last 3 years on revenue, profit, and innovation. And we found when we looked at the group that identified that they excelled or exceeded their competition on each of those three metrics, we also saw that they had sort of profound differences in their expectations for how they were going to perform on 5G and edge. So we didn't start off, we sort of looked at, again, we have a very strong data capability. We found that cohort just really kind of stood out for the lessons that it could instruct other CSPs. And one of the things, as you mentioned, is we saw that 14% of high performers 91% of them expect to outperform their current financial expectations within 5 years. And there's about roughly double in 3 years and 5 years, the high performers had expectations of success beyond the herd. And then when you started looking at other things that sort of stood out from that cohort, you saw by and large, they had much more of an emphasis on the strategic importance of digital platforms and of ecosystems, of taking an active role in providing technology into partner ecosystems. And that took the form of infrastructure, software, middleware, analytics, AI, machine learning. And then you also saw that cohort of high performers was much further along in their preparation to be able to deploy cloud-native themes like DevOps, and then also be able to deploy virtualization, containers, and data-driven management of the life cycle on cloud infrastructure.
Yeah, and it's we talk about digital transformation a lot, and this is not specific only to the telco industry, right? It really is the importance of digital platforms and partner ecosystems and hybrid cloud and cloud native capabilities and automation and all of those things. I mean, those are all fundamental underpinnings of businesses today, and very much fundamental underpinnings if you're in the telco business. So we talked a little bit about a lot of telcos have entered into partnerships with hyperscale cloud companies. And, what are the benefits of doing? I mean, I feel like there's some immediate benefits, but there's some very big risks. So talk with us just a little bit more about that, if you would.
Yeah, let's just be explicit and call it out sort of by name. There is a big debate that's on the top of the mind of CSP executives,
right?
Hyperscalers, friends or foes. Let's just be honest about it, right? And I would say, first of all, huge respect to the hyperscalers. Amazing companies. They've achieved these network effects. Huge credit to them. They're also incredible innovators, and they make great product, and they adapt very agilely. Their operations are insanely good, and so they're formidable. But they're also appealing to end users, whether it's consumers or enterprise users. I will note as well, one of the things we quoted from ABI research in the paper is that in 4G, typically 12 to 15% of services revenues were needed to recoup CapEx. With 5G, predominantly because you're building all this capability out to the edge, and that's just inherently expensive and hundreds of billions of dollars of radio infrastructure, that will go up to about 40%.
Right.
So, it's going to put CSPs under tremendous financial strain. So it's a very convenient and understandable strategy to say, hey, we're going to partner with the hyperscalers, which allow us to get to market quickly with really, really good products that our customers want.
Right.
Oh, hey, by the way, they can help to offset some of the build out of the capability. So it's on the surface kind of a very convenient way to sort of manage the balance sheet while ending up with really good stuff on their network that people want to buy. So I think that's great. Now, and again, I want to give a parallel, by the way. So this isn't the first time we've seen sort of the short-term thinking potentially complete track.
Right.
And, so I point back to streaming in Hollywood. So just a few years ago, there are these new, revenue streams. I can license my television shows or my movies to the streaming network and make near-term revenue. And wow, that's great. Wow, this is I'm getting
this little outfit called Netflix.
Yeah, it's Netflix. I'm going to make double my bonus this year. This is fantastic. And then only within a couple years, I remember the first headlines, if you remember back, was around House of Cards and how they had taken data back from the users and understood that they loved David Fincher and that they loved political dramas. And they loved Kevin Spacey. And so they put it together and said, hey, this data has allowed us to create this show.
Absolutely.
And it's a novelty, but it was a little bit more than that. If you're thinking about the industry and what's occurred since then, which is now Netflix has data and scale.
Right.
They don't need to rely on the incumbents like they did. They can start to produce their own programming, and now it's several $1 billion a year in original programming. Of course, it sparked an arms race because no longer are the predominant business models of the industry theatrical ticket sales or linear advertising,
right.
or certainly physical media. It's streaming, predominantly not just streaming. It's streaming subscriptions, it's digital advertising. And to a degree, it's e-commerce, if you look at Amazon. And to a degree, it's driving device sales, if you look at an Apple or a Samsung. So what you saw was a complete fundamental shift in the entire industry that was brought upon by really two things. So one, the obvious is, hey, we sought the near-term revenue. What we did is we sort of created this giant. But the other is something that CSPs really need to understand is coming their way, and they've seen it before, which if you look at WhatsApp, in 2014, WhatsApp took, I don't want to misquote it, I think it was tens of billions of dollars were taken away from SMS revenue. That would have been SMS revenue for the CSPs because essentially WhatsApp took texting and created an abstracted service over commodity data centers.
Right.
And so, we saw what happened. Same thing happened with video streaming over the last decade. Again, I mentioned I came from media and entertainment technology from post-production. I harken back to a project I did in Australia where it took 4 days to send something like 30 gigabytes from Australia to LA back in like the year 2000. It used to be extraordinarily expensive to do anything with high quality video, prohibitively expensive. You needed these massive purpose-built appliances. Sound familiar? Massive purpose-built appliances like a CSP network with So, but then what happened is the services, the video services were abstracted, those processes were abstracted, and they were put on commodity hardware by the hyperscalers.
Right.
And you saw this again, the theme, orders of magnitude, step function decreases in costs that were continuous over generations, an increase in capabilities, and that would include automation, like being able to work with CDNs and push high quality video out efficiently to the edge.
Right.
And what you saw was this combinatorial effect. And it's really important to understand what we're seeing in the evolution of technology now and is coming to this intelligent connectivity for CSP networks is multiple exponential technologies in confluence, combining. They're each going through exponential increases in their performance and decreases in price, and they're combining to sort of create a sum of the parts that's greater than the whole.
So I do think it's fascinating. And, we talked about the Netflix example. We can use the Amazon example and not even related to, Amazon's cloud services, which is a huge part of its company. But, today, you if you're selling something, you can sell something in a bricks and mortar location. You need to be able to sell something online. And generally speaking, you also need to consider being able to sell that in the Amazon marketplace. But the challenge there, and we've done this with clients before, is that you have to market your presence in the Amazon ecosystem, which is incredibly expensive to do. And you have to market your presence elsewhere, online, offline. And so it becomes part of this equation. But the thing that's really tricky about the reality of the necessity of having a presence in a marketplace like Amazon is that they have your data. They know who your customers are. So every person who buys from this partner ecosystem, you don't really know. You get the benefit of the revenue. It costs you a lot to get that revenue, but you don't know anything about those customers. And that's really where the challenge is. And from a business strategy standpoint, understanding what our customers need today, what they're going to need tomorrow, and not 5 years from now, truly within the next 12 months, within the next 24 months, where are they going to look for that? How are they going to get that? And how are we going to provide that? And that's really the kind of strategic business thinking. By the way, I'm not inventing any wheels here. Like, this isn't new or revelatory in any way, but it really is. We have to move beyond thinking of this is how business as usual is done in the CSP space, and really be thinking about how do we get out in front of this. And
Yeah,
it's
great.
and is it going to cost us money? Absolutely. Is it going to cost us, the time strategically and finding the right partners to work with and all that stuff? Absolutely. But, is it necessary for business continuity and business survival? I would say that's a resounding yes.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Everything you just said. Hallelujah. I would say be Bob Iger. I watch one masterclass episode a day. I'm a big fan, and I recently watched the Bob Iger one. And when
Uh-huh.
Bob Iger took over as CEO, he basically had sort of two major dimensions that he managed the company by. One was premium content. You saw the major acquisitions they did,
Right.
and building the brand. The other was technology. It was essentially understanding that the future of distribution and the relationship with the customer and data were the future of the company. And, huge a tip of the hat to them that during COVID, where essentially you have a business that's founded on theme parks, that they
Right.
actually were able to weather that to the extent that they did because they had made that pivot to a technology platform center.
Right.
Uh, and so again, it's not just the data, although the data is extraordinarily important. That you as a provider need to be able to have transparency into as much of the data about your customer as possible. But it's also the end user relationship. It's the ability to nurture that relationship across ever changing and expanding channels. And I know, so in our report, we gave a use case of somebody I think is really doing a good job of getting it right with their mobile edge computing platform, and that's Verizon. So Verizon has partnerships with Microsoft, they have partnerships with Amazon. Again, they're able to harness those amazing capabilities of these amazing companies and send it through to their end users. But they also have a flexible platform that they've built where they can build their own products, their own services on top of it. But they control the catalog, they control that front end relationship with the
Right.
customer, and they can adapt it and change it. So they're not selling through the front end of a partner. What they're doing is they're building a broad portfolio of very impressive capabilities with data under the hood, data, and it's connecting the ecosystem. And I mentioned before, so this is not by any means a death knell. It's a wake up call for the team.
Absolutely.
And there's some amazing advantages that CSPs have as the industry shifts to more of an ecosystem digital platform approach with network effects. Their points of presence represent trillions of dollars of investments that would be virtually impossible to replicate without them. So they're in a bit of a power position if they choose to actually work strategically and avoid some of the short-term traps. They're trusted. So generally, especially as data providers, their customers trust them to a much higher degree than other companies.
Right.
They have unique data, subscriber data, geolocation data, and again, they also have the existing relationships and sales capabilities to be able to sort of knit this stuff together knit the use cases together to be able to drive sustainable growth. And one other thing that I think is really, really important is I mentioned that third network effect, the control point. The control point sort of implies strict, almost monopolistic control. That's not the only way forward. There are ways in order to create value to the end user in the community that are open source, based on open standards. And so that is an advantage that the CSPs can have against some of these walled gardens. And another thing, I try to be more of a presentist than a futurist by law, but I'm really fascinated by when I say that, it's a big statement that I said that we're going to have the biggest period of economic growth and wealth transference in history. I think part of that is going to be Web 3.0, which has identity and geolocation built into it.
Right.
But it's also going to be in decentralized architectures, which are blockchain based, in some cases, not all cases, crypto based. But what you're about to see is a complete paradigm shift in how transactions work. Transactions of data, transactions of money. Right. And so again, what we're talking about are tens of trillions of dollars of new wealth that are traversing global CSP networks. So that's a huge opportunity for them to actually be responsible for optimizing the exchange of value across those networks. That requires them to actually take an active hand in building and managing these ecosystems, right, and avoiding giving the keys to the future to the hyperscalers. And again, I'm on another rant, but I want to just unpack one other thing I think could happen that's very bad for the CSPs.
I agree. And I think it's tremendously tempting, and there's so many examples of this. It's tremendously tempting to hand the keys over to somebody else because it's easier, faster, seems like, I just don't, there's so much to unpack here. There's so much to do or whatever. And it's just not, it is a dangerous move. It really is.
If I'm not Verizon and I don't own the platform and I don't own the ecosystem relationships in the front end, and I cede that to a cloud native company, which creates the service, the application, the solution. Well, and at the same time, standalone networks are inherently by standards and design cloud native. Eventually, they'll be provisioned and deployed through APIs and microservices. Right. So essentially, the application provider goes and configures the network on the back end. And even the CSP, which they will, has capabilities for network slicing and for really customizing those networks, in which, again, there'll be pockets of high margin growth within that. There'll be some salad days on the ride up for that. Right. But eventually the control goes to the cloud native company that just provisions that and bakes it into the actual service. And it ultimately has a commoditizing effect on the CSP.
Yeah. And, I do want to talk about IBM and cloud native and hybrid cloud here in a second. But one point that I want to make that I think is really important, and my team and I talk a ton about strategic partnerships. And every day, if you're paying attention, you see strategic partnerships one after the other, sometimes with big tech companies, sometimes with a big tech company and a small company. Strategic partnerships are the path forward. Finding those trusted partners, those trusted vendor partners, being able to have somebody help with the heavy lifting. You don't have to hand the keys to the business over. You can find the right strategic partner and, have help doing this along the way. And I think that for CSPs who might be thinking about this path and who might be feeling overwhelmed, I think that's really, really important to keep top of mind, is that I truly believe that the path forward, certainly as it relates to this, is finding the right strategic partner or partners and working together to get where you need to be.
100%. And so within this story, so things are going to change and the scale is going to change really at a pace that's historic. And there are a set of things that enterprises need to do, CSPs need to do for their core applications and services to evolve them and innovate them and adapt them efficiently on technology. And there is clearly a shift that's happening from legacy engineering to IT, from legacy engineering to integration. So that's happening for sort of how you ride the business forward. But then also we have consolidation. M&A is going to be a huge portion of this as well, which creates complexity and silos. So there's the de-siloing that has to happen and the cultural shifts that need to happen. And then there's the operations and the enterprise story. So how are we actually building and modernizing our platforms, modernizing our application infrastructures, building new applications and deploying them efficiently on cloud? And then now you have the sort of tertiary, how do we knit all these things together in order to be able to gain sustainable business advantage? So you need some partners here. I mean, you need some people that are helping you with generational change requires a generational shift in thinking, and generational shifts in thinking require action. So, yeah.
No, and I think too the way to think about this is, when you work with a vendor partner who plays a role in this digital transformation for companies across the board, different industries, different focuses, different customer base, all those different things. What you're getting is the benefit of all of the learning along the way. I mean, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to figure everything out for yourself. I think when you work with the right vendor partner or partners, you're getting the benefit of everything that they've learned along the way, what to do, what not to do, that sort of thing. I think that's tremendously valuable.
By the way, and the ecosystem that's being brought to bear, that's pre-integrated as well. Right. So that's growing as well. Again, everything you said is bang on. There's really a need for evolved partnerships here. Yeah. And also sort of keep in mind that another case study we gave in our paper was with Vodafone Idea, which is creating a universal cloud. So what they're doing is looking to consolidate their operations and their technology architectures across the consumer network, business to business, and IT into a total cost of ownership model. So they're shifting the cost structures so that they get as much efficiency as possible to be able to virtualize and manage all the way out from the centralized cloud to the radio infrastructure. So, again, that model of shifting from legacy siloed engineering into a more integrated partnership-driven approach is something that requires, a real multi-year evolved strategy. And as we know, the devil's in the details and the devil's in the execution. Ultimately, the winners are going to be the ones that are able to intelligibly and patiently be able to make those transitions.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. So I do want to finish up by talking just briefly about IBM and Cloudnative and hybrid cloud. So IBM's a cloud technology company, and talk with me just a bit about, what's the role of cloud native technologies in all of this?
Well, you mentioned automation.
Right.
One of the most interesting pieces of data that we got was we mentioned that we had this high performer segment, and that they differed in terms of their future expectations for 5G and edge. The most profound difference we had with them in the study was on automation of front, middle, and back office functions. So essentially, you saw that, if you can sort of interpret, high performers are much more technology integrated companies. They're much more IT centric, and they're much more driven on cloud.
Right.
And so, again, cloud being, you're seeing non-standalone networks are still largely driven by the legacy NEPS infrastructure and relationships, but standalone networks are inherently cloud native. And again, we saw data that shows that a high percentage of overall CSPs are going to be deploying standalone networks in 3 or 4 years.
Right.
So that's the window that they have to really evolve into the heart of their business being IT centric and cloud centric.
3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years. And then also, hey, what I'm saying as well is when we put this in the report, but there's sort of, if you look at any of the major projections for 5G edge computing growth, whether it's consumer, it's ICT, information communication technology provider revenues,
Right.
Consumer revenues, it's enterprise revenues. It's all the same story, which is you go from, depending on the projection, tens to hundreds of billions of dollars of growth between now and about 2024, and then from hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars of value. So it's these two sort of S curves. And you have this exponential growth, but the absolute value in the second one from 2025 forward is just monumentally huge in terms of raw numbers. But
Right.
it's happening in these sort of stages. You have this sort of startup cycle that we're in now, and then you're going to ride that into this hyper growth. So when the hyper growth happens, again, don't discount that the scale that needs to happen at. Think about autonomous vehicles and all the intelligence needs to be located close to the car. The amount of economic might that has to be brought to bear will only be able to happen from digital platforms that are already established, already have user bases, already have infrastructure footprints in 3 or 4 years. And now there's exceptions to this rule. There are going to be plenty of CSPs that are regional niche that are able to go do network slicing or provide legacy connectivity. But what you're going to see with this economic paradigm shift that's coming is that the network itself is going to commoditize at a rate faster than the technology expansion. And we see evidence of that. It happened in cloud computing. It's just the nature of what happens. So if the idea is that you're going to go, it's a rising tide lifts all ships, and I'm a CSP and I'm going to go out, there's more connectivity means more revenue. It means shrinking margins unless you're actually adapting and have a platform strategy and execute it well over the next 3 to 4 years.
Right. So for our audience, 3 to 4 years. Don't.
One more thing.
Yeah.
So we also saw, like, there's been, so I mentioned sort of you have this first wave of digitization, which was PCs, and then it's shift from, to open innovation and software innovation,
Right.
Commoditizing the hardware. That tradition gets carried into the cloud computing, and now it's being brought into the network and network cloud. So we've seen that sort of evolution of waves, and each one of them step function increases in capability and decreases in cost. Well, there's also been previous waves of telecommunications transformation as well. So there was the adoption of TCP/IP, then there was the evolution to mobile, and now, in concert with this evolution to network cloud, there's a new model for telcos, which is a platform-driven, services-driven,
Right.
Provisioning of services. So all this is sort of happening. It's all building up to a crescendo for this 3 or 4 window to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Crescendo. I love that word. I don't think it's used enough, Chad.
I don't either.
I like it. I'm kind of a word nerd, as in addition to being a tech nerd. So I just kind of own the nerd crown all the time.
I just say those C words, chrysanthemum and crystal. I think there's a few words that we need to get into the lexicon more.
We need to use more. Yes, I agree. Well, I'm with you on that. Chad Andrews from the IBM Institute for Business Value. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed not only the conversation, but I really enjoyed diving into your report on how 5G and edge computing will completely help redefine this, who wins in the booming digital economy. So we're going to, we'll link that report into our show notes here. I highly encourage you to download it and dive into it just like I have. I learned so much from it. I've learned so much from you, and we're pretty dialed into this industry, but it's really been fascinating, Chad, and I so appreciate you hanging out with me today.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me on. It's been fun.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, we'll do it again soon, I'm sure.
Right?
All right. Thanks, everyone, for hanging out with us today.